Is water wet?
It is not.
Possibly.
No.
When you're underwater, you're not wet.
You're part of the ocean. I would agree with that, actually.
You're wet when you get out of the water, but not underwater, you're not wet.
I like that. I do agree with that. I hate that I agree with that, but I do.
It's true. You agree with it because it's true.
What's the definition of wet? Let's look that up really quick.
Soaked. I mean, water on you.
Well, okay.
We don't say that air is on us, do we?
Covered with water.
Yes.
You can't be more covered with water than being under the water.
That is.
But it cancels out because you're not covered in air right now.
Just another question here on the sidebar. It says specifically, is water wet? And it says water is both wet and not wet at the same time. Confused? Let's break it down. Okay, we're going to let the show go a little longer because we're going to get to the bottom of this. It's saying since it's the thing that makes things wet, so water itself cannot be wet. If you're under the water, you're still fucking wet. But water can't become wet.
Not until you get out of water.
Water, because wet is being covered in water. Yeah. Water can't be just covered with water. It's just water then.
So does water make water wet?
No, because water is the thing that makes things wet.
So the water in the ocean does not make the water in the ocean wet. The water is the component that makes things wet, but not the
water. Water is the wetter. It makes things wet.
This is good.
I don't know how you don't say if you're underwater, you're not wet. What are you talking about?
I think
okay. So the point that you become wet is the immediate point that air touches you.
I would say yes.
Why?
Because you're part of the ocean.
I'm not a scientist.
Because you're part of the ocean like the rest of the water.
Thank you, Trevor.
It's just you're covered with water. So you come out of the water. I'm wet.
Yes.
To dry off, should I go back in the water?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of the world, in relation to what you're in, you would be dry.
Being wet is not relative to something else. It's not.
I think in this case it is.
I think it is.
Being more wet would be relative, but being wet or not it's just yes or no. It's black or white.
I disagree with that. I think it's clearly gray. You've been talking about this for 10 minutes. It's clearly not black and white.
It is, though. It is. You guys are trying to live in this gray area, and I'm telling you, not everything needs to have a fucking hypothetical. It's just you're wet or you're not. To be wet, you have to be covered in water. Water being covered in water is still just water.
It's wet water.
It's like if you have a glass of lemonade, Luke.
Do you understand how crazy that sounds? That wet water.
Yes.
That's why you're not wet when you're underwater.
Luke, no. No, I don't.
Yes. So that's my point, though. Like, if you're underwater, water is also underwater.
No. Water's not. What do you mean? It's not.
The water's just a huge fucking thing?
The water is still the water. It's not under itself. It's just water.
I think there's water underwater.
Have you ever taken a glass of water and then you added more water to it? It's not the water went on top of the water. It's just all water there. It's a liquid. That's what liquids do.
How do underwater lakes exist then?
Is water wet? It depends on whether you ask a scientist or an English teacher. Well, I'm not asking an English teacher science questions.
This is turned into a philosophy question.
It's like asking a journalist about football. Like, they don't know football.
If we ever try to sell this podcast, this should be the clip we use.